Thank you, Karin, for handling all the details and your great crew. Especially thank you, Greg, not only for inviting me, but for all the great work you're doing, changing the world, getting us out of the mess that we're in. So following the theme of the mess that we're in, I'm going to elaborate a bit on what you've already heard from both Gary and Zoe, a bit about dietary guidelines that are way off, but then really do a deep dive into the mess that we've seen with cholesterol information or misinformation. So I have a personal stake in why I'm up here. I'm a neuroscientist, been a neuroscientist for 40 years. I'm not talking about my neuroscience research, I'm talking about how this has affected me personally. 1999, I was diagnosed with a genetic anomaly called familial hypertriglyceridemia, which means I'm extremely efficient at producing fat. A person with my kind of genotype can be obese very easily. And so this was 1999, and you see that through 2007. So I battled this hypertriglyceridemia. I have my triglycerides, for example, were 800. HDL was extremely low at about 30. So you want your triglycerides HDL ratio to be maybe 2, no more than 3 to 1. My ratio was 25 to 1, which is extremely dangerous. So I took it very seriously. I exercised like crazy, and I followed the dietary guidelines, which you can see right here. And I'm sure Zoe will cringe at this. This was my guide. 1999, I knew a whole lot about the brain, but basically nothing about diet and heart disease. And so the American Heart Association website, I'm looking at reducing my saturated fats, went low in meat, exercised like crazy. I ate oatmeal so I could lower my cholesterol. I ate beans so I could lower my cholesterol. And so I followed these guides. I was very concerned about my cholesterol, concerned about saturated fat. By 2007, the only thing I had accomplished was my triglycerides went higher, my HDL went lower, and I got fat. I was never obese, but I was about 30 pounds heavier than I am now. I remember that moment, and it's actually at dietdoctor.com, which they interviewed me, that moment in 2007 when my doctor sat me down and said, "You've done your best. You've followed the diet recommendations, you've exercised, and you haven't been able to improve. You gained weight, and your triglycerides are still sky high. You must go on a statin." To which I was actually amenable at the time. I didn't know what statins were. But I do remember that moment when I said, well, I've got a PhD in biology. The least I can do is read about what is a triglyceride and what I should do about it. And I remember that moment in my office when I read a few papers on the physiology of triglycerides, and it just struck me. I said, damn, it's the bread and the potatoes and the sugar I've been eating. I've been so happy eating bread without butter, and so it's the bread that's driving up my triglycerides. So at that time then, I was struck by this epiphany that I'd been given the wrong information. A few papers led to a few thousand papers, and that's what led me to here to you today. Talk both about a little bit about diet, because you've heard plenty from Zoe already, but also about cholesterol. So as a result of what I've learned now, this is now about 10 years in which I've been sharing this information, what I've realized is everything you see up here is bogus, absolutely bogus. Or as my European UK friends, it's just rubbish. Okay? And so that's part of what you've already heard. This is just not right. And I want to cover just a little bit and say, so where did this come from? This fear of saturated fat. And so I think it's important to point out that to a great extent, there is one man that owns that misinformation, Ancel Keys. So in 1961, here you see on the cover of Time magazine, a man who knew nothing about nutrition, knew nothing about heart disease, and this man was in charge to a great extent of nutrition and heart disease research in America. A man who had a bachelor's in economics, and I've heard he had 2 PhDs, but frankly, neither one had anything to do with nutrition or heart disease. And what did Keys say in 1961? Americans eat too much fat, too much saturated fat. You eat saturated fat, you raise your cholesterol, you damage your arteries. So Americans have to reduce their fat consumption, especially saturated fat, to almost nothing. And he stated this as a fact. This is what's so important. This was stated as dogma, not as a hypothesis. And there was absolutely no basis whatsoever for these recommendations. Now that's 1961. Here it is now, 2019. That same information is now being put forth. You go to the American Heart Association website. The same information is still there. They are demonizing saturated fat. They're recommending an ultra-low-fat diet. They're still recommending margarine over butter at this present time. And why? The American Heart Association is a private organization not beholden to anybody but their sponsors. They have no interest in the health of Americans. They have an interest in supporting their sponsors, which includes the corn and soybean oil industry and the pharmaceutical. This is what I have now learned in the past 10 years, and I'll elaborate on that a bit later. So I want to point out also that it's not as if we've learned something new about saturated fat and triglycerides. That information was all there before. So this is an incredibly important paper. It's coincidental. It's the same year that Ancel Keys is seen as the expert in the world, at least in the country, on diet. And he's demonizing fat. Well, here, Pete Ahrens at Rockefeller University published a paper studying people on low-carb or low-fat diet. And what they've come up with is carbohydrate-induced lipemia, which means you consume carbohydrates, you increase fat in your blood. And that's related then to obesity, 1961. And the effect was so profound that they showed the serum from a person on the high carbohydrate diet. The lipemic plasma related to consuming carbohydrates, and you see this thick serum right here, carbohydrate-induced lipemia. The same person who has this thick plasma is now put on a low carbohydrate diet. And they're now pointing out the clear plasma occurs when someone is put on a high-fat diet. So this is really nothing new. I mean, we are getting enlightened by talks such as Zoe and talks that Gary has given. But this information was out there decades ago. And so I also want to credit Zoe. And I don't need to go into any further because her work is just magnificent review, not only of the current literature, but she actually looked back at what did we know in the 1970s. And what we knew in the 1970s did not justify the dietary guidelines. We were misinformed. And she stated, and her group of authors stated, not only was it inaccurate at the time, those dietary guidelines should not even have been introduced. So the misinformation has been out there for decades. And only now I think we're getting so many people studying this that we're catching up to that misinformation. So what we have is clearly money. The food drug companies have proposed this cholesterol theory, which ultimately was the end of the diet-heart hypothesis. And it's clearly wrong. So the first phase, which I've only touched upon since we covered this all today, is clearly saturated fat consumption does not contribute to either obesity or heart disease on a low-carb diet. Okay, so now let's do a deep dive further into LDL. So does LDL, this is the meat of the talk, does cholesterol actually cause heart disease, and specifically LDL? All right, this is an incredibly important study. This is a powerful, influential study. It is still cited, even though you're looking at total cholesterol, this is a study that is repeatedly cited to the present day that cholesterol causes people to die as a result of artery blockage. So this is the Mr. Fit study in which you have middle-aged men that were followed, large number of middle-aged men over the course of many years, about 7 years or so. And you're looking at their vulnerability to die as a result of their cholesterol level. And so this is the rate of death, beginning with 1.0 is your reference value with the lowest cholesterol. And so as you go to higher levels of cholesterol, you are looking at higher rates of death from coronary heart disease. So from the 1 to the 2, you're looking at twice the rate of death. 2 to 3, 3 times. So at 4.0, you're looking at 400% deaths from coronary heart disease as a function of cholesterol. So the point of this article is, it's not just people with super high cholesterol that die of heart disease. Any small increment of cholesterol brings you closer to your deathbed. So I looked at this paper and I looked at the raw data. Okay? So I was curious as to what was the actual rate of death for the individuals in this study. I'm going to show you then the raw data in this study that shows the actual rate of death of the population, because this is just a ratio. So what percentage of people actually died as a result of their cholesterol levels? So on this scale here, you're looking up to 100%. You're looking at now at the percent of people that did not die, okay, as a function of their cholesterol levels. And that's in blue. Just take that in for a moment. Okay? These people were horribly uncooperative. There almost nobody died in this study. And so the blue shows you the percentage of people that did not die, and they're almost all at 100%. So for ease of viewing, I'm going to put a line across at 99%. So 99% of the people did not die. So at the lowest level of cholesterol, you have slightly more than 99% did not die. And at the most extreme level of cholesterol, slightly less than 99% did not die. How do you get? It's the same data originating to make the blue bars as to make the red bars. How do you get from the blue bars to the red bars? Well, what you have here are the raw data again. 0.3% of the people with the lowest cholesterol died of coronary heart disease. If we go to the farthest extreme, where you've got the 4.0, meaning 400% increase in death, most extreme value is 1.3% of the people died of coronary heart disease. Across the entire, essentially almost the entire spectrum of cholesterol levels, you have a difference of only 1%. And what did they do? Well, to calculate this level, you take the 1.3% divided by 0.3%, and you get 4.13. And that's how you create a 400% difference in the rate of death based on cholesterol. But the real difference is 1%. Now, why was it that Stamler used the data in red and not the data in blue in promoting the study and continuing to promote it? Because the cholesterol hypothesis was failing. Numerous studies have been looking for an association of cholesterol to heart disease death, and they had failed. Studies had been lowering cholesterol for decades, and they had failed. This was desperation time. Cholesterol hypothesis was dying, and so they had to promote this because they couldn't admit that looking at cholesterol itself is not associated with death. Now let's go to the highest level. This is what people fear: extremely high cholesterol. That's total cholesterol over 290, which means you are now into that range in which there's a genetic susceptibility, familial hypercholesterolemia. And just pause for a moment. These are men that have extremely high cholesterol, and yet almost none of them died. And so this is a problem if you think of familial hypercholesterolemia people as dying at a relatively high rate. So let's look further into FH, or familial hypercholesterolemia. And so this has been very well studied. First half of the 20th century, what you see is it's genetic anomaly in which is impaired LDL receptor functioning, which ultimately results in extremely high cholesterol levels. You have high cholesterol levels, and you have cholesterol within the artery wall, right here. So there's cholesterol in the artery wall, and you see some individuals die at a relatively young age. You put that all together, and it's pretty obvious, cholesterol must be killing people. Okay? The high cholesterol in FH causes heart disease. Well, it's very simple. As a scientist, I just tested the hypothesis. If people with FH are dying young, then you just look for evidence of premature death in people who have extremely high cholesterol levels. And second, then, if it's the cholesterol causing death from heart disease, then all you have to do is bring the cholesterol down, and you're going to see these people live a lot longer. Well, here is the first major paper studying an enormous number of people, over 1,000 people diagnosed with familial hypercholesterolemia. And what you're finding is a normal distribution of these people with FH in the population. And they made it very clear in Journal of Medicine, 1966, our studies provide no evidence that being diagnosed with FH shortens the life of affected individuals, men or women. These people have a normal lifespan, and they live into the 7th and 8th decades. Now, you don't hear about this in your medical education, and this kind of study they want to ignore. But this has actually been replicated numerous times, in which you find actually people have extremely high cholesterol have extraordinary health. People with high cholesterol have a significantly lower rate of cancer and infectious disease, and live overall normal lifespan, because elderly people with FH do not have a higher rate of cardiovascular disease. Here's just a more recent study. I don't depend on a study from 50 years ago. Here's a more recent study. People genetically confirmed to have FH. Their cholesterol levels are about 3 times normal. LDL is over 200. And you're looking then at death, overall all-cause mortality. You're looking from birth through over 80 years of age. And what you find here is this slight increase in the first few decades of life is because you do see an increased rate of cardiovascular disease in these people, which I'll get to mechanism later. But it is not statistically significant. And realize, when you're looking here, this is the rate of death in the general population. There is almost no death in individuals in the first few decades of life. The rate of death is typically 1% or less. So this is relative to the general population. So relative to the general population, almost none of the people with FH are dying young, and it's not statistically significant. And what is so important is these people now over the decades have a lower rate of death as they get older. And there is this idea put out there of LDL burden, that the LDL then accumulates in your arteries, making you more and more susceptible to die of heart disease. Well, this makes no sense at all, because that slightly elevated rate of death now declines until there is a statistically significant reduction in death in people 70 to 79 years of age. And they didn't do statistics from 60 through beyond 80. But it looks like if they had combined everybody over 60 years of age, you would find a significant low rate of death for people with astronomically high levels of cholesterol. And the reasoning is very simple. These people don't have a higher rate of heart disease, and they have a lower rate of cancer, of type 2 diabetes, and death from infectious disease. To have the diagnosis of FH after the age of 60 means you are healthier than the general population. You sure didn't expect to hear that, did you? Okay. And again, these authors confirm this. This isn't just my interpretation. They confirm that compared to the general population, people 70 to 79 years of age, again with cholesterol, total cholesterol 400, LDL 250, these people have a lower rate of death based on their overall improved health. Now, this isn't just the FH population. There are numerous studies that have conducted longitudinal analyses of people based on their cholesterol levels. When you look at older people, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and you look at their cholesterol level, and in this case, you're looking out 20 years. You get their cholesterol levels, older person, and see who's alive 20 years later. What you find is the older people who have the highest cholesterol live longer. People with low cholesterol die off at a much higher rate. So low cholesterol is associated with increased risk of death. It is unhealthy to have low cholesterol. And I love what they have here. This is our interpretation. This is just so candid about them, just saying how they feel. We have been unable to interpret our results because everybody told us how bad cholesterol is for you. And these damn people were just living longer. But they actually provide a really great review. This is just one of many studies. They reviewed the literature and said, in fact, actually our study is consistent with a large literature that says that having high cholesterol is healthier, is a sign of good health compared to people with low cholesterol. And in fact, they say right here, this work casts doubt on the justification for lowering cholesterol, especially in an older person. And understand, talking about people over 60 that are at the highest risk of stroke and heart disease. So when you're at the greatest risk of dying of cardiovascular disease, that is in fact when having high cholesterol appears to be protective for life. Since I don't have time to cover the entire literature, we'll point out that I'm now working with an outstanding group of clinician scientists led by Uffe Ravenscoff. And we reviewed the entire literature, not just cholesterol, but we specifically reviewed the literature on the bad cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, in which we've looked at people's rate of death in people with the highest cholesterol. We did not find a single study that showed that older individuals die at a higher rate with high cholesterol compared to low cholesterol. And in fact, overall, the people with the highest cholesterol, not even just FH, in the general population, those people that had the highest cholesterol live longer than those people with low cholesterol. And so our conclusion was This analysis certainly provides reason to question the cholesterol hypothesis, that hypothesis that cholesterol is actually causing harm to an individual. So when we look at LDL as a causal factor in developing heart disease, the evidence is not there. There are some associational studies, but there is no evidence of LDL causing harm. So all I can say is, you lie. We have been deceived. We've been deceived to call, I hate liars. We have been deceived to call LDL bad cholesterol, to see LDL as something toxic in our bodies. LDL is not harmful. In fact, as Ufi said earlier today, LDL is a part of our immune system. When we have an infection, we have a pathogen invasion, it is LDL that works with our white blood cells to attack the pathogen. And that's what you actually find in the coronary arteries. When there is an infection, the reason why LDL is in there, in part, is to work with the macrophage to kill the bacteria. And that is why you ultimately find LDL in the coronary artery. It's not only killing the pathogen, which is associated with heart disease, but it's also used to rebuild the tissue. Well, we get to the big bugaboo. I mean, everything I'm saying is if LDL is so good for us, then how come lowering LDL is so effective at reducing the rate of heart disease? Okay? So cholesterol reduction, it's got to improve cardiovascular outcomes. Well, where did that come from? Where is the idea that lowering cholesterol is good for us? You may be surprised that our fellow Ancel Keys comes up once again. Not only did he have bad dietary advice, he had bad cholesterol advice. So in fact, he did find something that is correct. Ancel Keys was one of the people who discovered that when you consume corn oil, that your cholesterol drops. Your total cholesterol drops. And here's a paper he published in 1957. And he wrote in that paper, hypercholesterolemia could be corrected by consuming corn oil. And so corn oil, in theory, would be the first treatment for someone that had hypercholesterolemia. If you consume corn oil, you will then be at less risk for developing heart disease. That hypothesis was tested in this paper published in 1965 by Rose et al. What they had were people who already had heart attacks at very high risk of dying from heart disease. You had men, in which you now have, it's very simple, two groups. You have men that are given the best treatment of the time. They're put on a low cholesterol, low fat diet, and they were to have a few tablespoons of corn oil every day. And I got to believe that the doctors in this trial must have had an ethical quandary about a control group. The control group is at very high risk of dying of heart disease. But they didn't say this to them, but it's equivalent to saying, listen, you go home, we're not giving you any treatment, eat your crappy diet, we're not going to give you the corn oil, you need to go home and die because you're the placebo group. And so what they're expecting is with low cholesterol, the control group is going to die at a higher rate, and they're going to show superior survival with the group that has the corn oil. Well, first, the trial was successful in that it did show that those men on the low-fat, low-cholesterol, corn oil supplemented diet did have lower cholesterol. So that's right here on the right. So they had high cholesterol over 260, which dropped down to 230. So you're dropping cholesterol by about 10%. The control group showed no change in their cholesterol. And this trial is very simple. If you die, you're out of the trial. Or if you have a heart attack, you're out of the trial. So we're looking at the percentage of people now that didn't die or didn't have a heart attack that are still in the trial 3 years later. So that's what we're looking at now at the results. And here are the results. The placebo group, or the basically control group, 75% of these men were still in the trial, did not have a heart attack or die. But in the treatment group, the low-fat, low-cholesterol diet and corn oil, only 50% of the people were still in the trial. So the experimental group died at basically twice the rate of those that were in the control group. And so the healthy diet and the cholesterol reduction is now associated with more death. And I like, there's a quote from John Abramson, dying with corrected cholesterol is not a successful outcome. which is really what happened here. And the authors were very clear. There's nothing ambiguous about this. The authors stated, we cannot recommend corn oil in the treatment of ischemic heart disease. And yet, you find corn oil is still recommended. American Heart Association website today. They recommend corn oil over butter. And you see the products now. You have heart-healthy corn oil. And they're saying corn oil is better than olive oil because it lowers your cholesterol so well. And that is because the reason why is they have purchased the rights from the American Heart Association to say corn oil is heart healthy. It is heart healthy because it lowers cholesterol. Corn oil lowering cholesterol will cause you to die, but it doesn't really matter as long as you've got the lower cholesterol. Okay? This is the thinking that comes out of the American Heart Association. All right, so let's now fast forward to some drug studies. This statement in this paper published in 1984 really summarizes the literature up to 1984. Cholesterol-lowering trials had failed. 1984, at that time, now decades of studies, there really wasn't good evidence that you could lower cholesterol and people would be healthier, people live longer, have less heart attacks. This was the biggest study ever on record. 500,000 men were studied here. So what you've got is blood samples from almost 500,000 men, and you're getting the men that had the highest cholesterol. So only the top 5% averaging 290 total cholesterol, and only those that had at least 190 in LDL. So that is extremely high, about twice as much as the American Heart Association now recommends. Those were the men included in the study. So they were at extremely high risk of dying from heart disease. So they were treated with rather primitive drug, cholestyramine, which is a bile sequestering agent. Can make basically a person feel really ill, gastrointestinal disease, disorder, but it does lower cholesterol significantly. And so this is a very long trial, 7.4 years, and you got men with lower cholesterol compared to men who were given placebo. This was the breakthrough people needed. This was the first trial that actually showed that less people would die as a result of cholesterol reduction. And this is cut and paste right from the study. Cholestyramine group experienced a 24% reduction in death from coronary heart disease. But what's also in the paper, and this is a cut and paste directly from their results, the risk of death was not reduced in the cholestyramine group. So you've got a 24% reduction in death from heart attacks, and yet the cholestyramine people are not living longer. How is that possible? So we look at the data. It's always important to look at the data. I'm showing you the data in the study. But instead of looking at the number of deaths, what I'm looking at is the percent of people that did not have an adverse event. An adverse event, for example, being death. Okay? So if you didn't die, okay, then therefore that would be here in survival. Those people that survived, which as you can see, pretty much identical. And so you're looking at each different event, the percent of people that did not have an event, such as dying of coronary heart disease. And this is like a Where's Waldo kind of thing, okay? Someone, I dare you, challenge you to find a 24% reduction in anything. And that 24% reduction is right there. This microscopic difference right there. And what you got, 500,000 men get the 3,800 that have the highest level of cholesterol. Half get placebo, half get drug. The drug people have reduced levels of cholesterol. In the end, the difference was 8 men across those two groups. That's 0.4% in the percent of people who died. But it's 24%, which is reported in the paper. How can you take 0.4% and then report it as 24%? Well, this is what we call relative risk. In relative risk, you can amplify minuscule effects, near zero effects, and they become very large effects. Like, this is an extraordinary manipulation of the data. It's sort of like statistical alchemy. Turn lead into gold with the data. You take the 0.4%, that's right there between the two death rates, divide it by 1 of those reported data, which is the 1.6%, which actually wasn't even a correct way to do it. But you take the 0.4, divide it by 1.6, and what do you get? 24%. You have now created an improvement in outcome from essentially nothing. And this was not statistically significant. This was an effect, again, I want to emphasize, was not statistically significant, but reported as a 24% change. This trial failed. It was another trial that absolutely failed at lowering cholesterol and looking at outcomes. The director really should have said, listen, we have tried. It's been decades, and we keep failing. Lowering cholesterol is just simply not helping. And what did they do? They declared victory. The director of the study said this is a turning point in cholesterol heart disease research. We now can cure cholesterol. That's in this article. All we have to do is lower cholesterol and people don't die. They also added that cholestyramine has a lot of adverse side effects, difficult to take. So what we need is medication. We need something better than cholestyramine because we're right on the way. We are curing people of heart disease, but we need something more efficient than cholestyramine. And that more efficient drug is statins. So we've now entered the statin era, controlling cholesterol with statins. So let's look at the statin trials. And of course, everybody calls it the wonder drugs. Statins have huge effects. Lipitor, reduce the risk of heart attack by 36%. And this is a very important ad, and this study was very important because it was this Lipitor study that propelled Lipitor now to be generating over $100 billion in revenue. So let's look at the Lipitor study. And it's right here. Again, it's a Where's Waldo kind of thing. This is the study that showed a 36% reduction in events in risk from heart disease. And again, I'm showing you the percent of people that did not have an adverse event. Because this is really what you want to do. You go to your doctor and you say, well, my cholesterol is 300. What's the likelihood that I will not have a heart attack, that I will not die? Well, that answer is right here. The percent of people that did not have an adverse event, and again, placebo and experimental groups are virtually identical in their outcomes. So where is that 36% reduction in the risk of heart disease? It's right there. That sliver of a difference is a 36% reduction. That is what you saw in the ad. And so, in fact, what they had to do was combine the absence of a non-fatal heart attack plus fatal heart attacks to be able to achieve statistical significance. Either one alone was not significant. So, I'm looking around the room and I get the same look I get from cardiologists, which is kind of like this little guy. The little guy is saying, come on, seriously, I wasn't born yesterday. Are you telling me this is it? That is a 36% difference? You telling me this? So there's no tooth fairy, there's no Santa Claus, and statins aren't wonder drugs. That's what I'm telling you. So how do you get 36% out of that? It's the same game they were playing in 1984. So let's look at the real data. The real data you find is in actually a 1.1% in this particular manipulation, this particular observation. The difference between placebo and the drug, the Lipitor, is about 1.1%. What that means is if you go to the doctor and say, if I take the Lipitor, what's the likelihood I won't have either heart attack or death from a heart attack? Well, with the Lipitor, 98%. And then you say, well, what if I do nothing? Well, your likelihood of having neither is 97%. Those are pretty good odds. If you do nothing, you have a 97% chance of not having a heart attack. So the real difference is 1%. But the ad said 36%. So they're promoting this as a 36%, but I just showed you 1%. Well, did anyone notice in the ad, this little part down here? Let's expand that blue font on the blue background. This means in the clinical trial, 3% taking the sugar pill or placebo had a heart attack compared to 2% taking the Lipitor. I'm sure it's the lawyers that had them put that part in right there, right? So they're telling you the real difference is 1%. You have 1% difference, 1 point difference. That means for every 100 people prescribed Lipitor, only one person will have one less heart attack. It will have no effect in 99 out of 100 people. And again, how do you get 36%? You take the 1.1%, which is the difference, divided by the difference of the placebo between 100 and 97. Why? Who cares? It doesn't matter. This is just a way to amplify your findings. And so you take the 3% on the placebo side that had the heart attack, 1.1 divided by 3 is 36%. And that's how you sell this. You sell it to physicians, you sell it to the public by saying these are wonder drugs, that they will reduce risk in such a high percentage of the population. But it makes a difference in about 1% of the population. So if you actually had truth in advertising, I mean, imagine that. The real number is 1%. So if you actually had an ad that was accurate, that said Lipitor reduces the risk of heart attack by 1%, how many people would take it? Especially as we talk later about the adverse effects. Now, another trial, and I have heard about Jupiter so much. The thing about the Jupiter trial was you had relatively healthy people, primary prevention, but these are people who have high inflammation, high CRP. And that's another thing statins do, is they can reduce inflammation. And so there was this phenomenal study, New England Journal of Medicine, and you see what the director of the study, John Castelline, said. It's spectacular. We have evidence that a statin prevents a first heart attack. Steve Nissen, director of the Cleveland Clinic, cardiology, Cleveland Clinic. It's breathtaking. It's a blockbuster. It's paradigm shifting. It's like he's talking about the next, Bruce Willis, Die Harder, Die Harder 47. This is the greatest thing that ever happened. It is a blockbuster. So we are looking for great effects from the Jupiter study. Well, even though I'm not an MD, I often do take the CME courses to see how the statin effects are presented to MDs. So this is from a CME course given to doctors. So this is a slide on the Jupiter effect on the benefit, which looks really impressive. 44% reduction in events in these relatively healthy people. So let's look a little closer at this. The study was actually terminated at 1.9 years. I mean, almost nobody is in the study out after 2 years. So all the data to the right of 1.9 years don't count. So we stopped the graph, really. This is when the study was finished. That is the 44% effect. Now look at the scale. I want to show you how we are deceived. The actual scale, if everybody had a heart attack, it would be 1.0. So this scale goes up to 1.0 if there's a high rate of heart attacks. Notice this scale doesn't even go to 0.1. So you are looking at a fraction of the actual data. Brace yourselves. I'm now going to show you, this is cut and paste, this is not my graph. I'm going to show you the graph directly out of the New England Journal of Medicine showing the same data for those two lines. That's it. I'm serious about this. This is like a magician, that right in front of you can do magic and you don't notice it. They are doing this right in front of you. They are not committing fraud. I never accuse pharma or the people who published work of fraud. They're doing this right in front of you. Those are two lines. And right there is a 44%. Now, how is that a 44% difference? Because there were almost no effects. Only about 0.7% of the placebo group had any event. And about 0.4% of the people given Crestor had an event. When you look at 0.7 down to 0.4, that's a 44% reduction. But the real difference was about 0.3% benefit. So this is deception at the highest level. It's deception right before your eyes. And I just want to remind you what Steve Nissen said. I just can't get past this. Steve Nissen somehow, very well paid by pharma, very well supported in his research and personally by pharma, can somehow look at that and call it breathtaking. I think it's important to see this. It's important to name names, to call people out. This is ridiculous. I mean, these are the people who are in a position of authority. These are the people who make the cholesterol guidelines. These are people very well paid by pharma who are looking at a finding like that and now promoting Crestor, which, again, is now generating billions in revenue for its company. I often hear people say, well, I've just shown you primary prevention studies. What about secondary preventions? The doctors are often saying, well, they may have weak effects for primary prevention, but they are really effective in secondary prevention for people who have had heart disease. So this is one of the studies, and I'd like to point out the best studies. This is one of the studies people often point to. This is the British Heart Protection Study. Huge number of people, all at high risk for heart disease. Either they've already had a heart attack, they have hypertension, and a subset of them were treated with statin. And so you're looking at the outcome now. This is secondary prevention. It looks remarkably similar to the outcomes you had in 1984 and the other work. Again, looking at percent of people who did not have an adverse event. And so down here, for any major coronary events, you have some separation. You have a few percent difference when you combine any possible event. And this is what people like to point to. But let's look at how this is now presented to the medical community and the public. So here is a news report from the director of the study, Rory Collins. So he's talking about this study, which he's now declared statins are now the new aspirin. That if we could just give statins to 10 million high-risk people, we would save 50,000 lives. That's 1,000 lives a week, which is huge. It's really great numbers. We can reduce the incidence of heart attacks and strokes by 1/3. Well, it wasn't up there 1/3. Now, I know people are going to want to get out their calculators when I tell you this, but take my word for it. If you take 10 million and divide it by 50,000, you get 200. Okay, that's the number needed to treat. These are not my numbers. These are Rory Collins' numbers, the world's strongest statin advocate. What he's telling you is that if you've already had a heart attack and you're the prescribing doctor, you need to prescribe the statin to 200 people at very high risk for a heart attack for only one life to be saved. There will be no benefit for 199 out of 200 people. So you see how weak, how impotent statins are at really making a difference in survival and overall events. I don't just lecture on this. This is now a second career for me in addition to my neuroscience work. I just had a great pleasure in working with Uffe Ravenskov and others, and we are publishing what I've just presented to you. Here's a paper we published about 4 years ago, just on what I told you about, and we made the title as clear as possible. Statistical deception has created the appearance that statins are safe and effective in both primary and secondary prevention. We outlined first that elevated levels of cholesterol are not atherogenic, that in fact you're healthier if you have high cholesterol. We have addressed the use of relative risk to deceive people. And finally then now I've talked about adverse effects. Because yes, there is a small benefit with statins, a 1 to 2% benefit with the statins. But let's talk about adverse effects, which have greatly been downplayed and even ignored by those in charge statin advocates. So there is a massive literature on adverse effects of statins. Here are just a few of the studies and reviews. It's type 2 diabetes, rhabdo, cognitive disorders, cataracts, renal failure, liver dysfunction, very well described in the peer-reviewed medical literature. Here's just one example of a study. And normally what you see from the statin advocates, they say, well, type 2 diabetes is very rare. Well, that's because they're not looking for it. If you're not looking for something, you're not going to find it. This was a beautiful RCT, a trial, in which you have people who didn't have type 2 diabetes at the beginning of the trial. And you're actually getting all the measures. You're getting their A1C. You're getting their fasting glucose and their HOMA-IR. And now you're actually studying them over the course of years, comparing placebo to statin-treated individuals. And you see spontaneously development of type 2 diabetes in 6% of the placebo, but now you've got 11% of the statin-treated individuals are developing type 2 diabetes. So you are adding 5% to that group, which now increases their risk of not only developing heart disease, but other diseases as well. So the type 2 diabetes effect is very real. It's very rare to find a study go out more than 3 or 4 years. Part of that reason is there is evidence of relation of statins to cancer, but it takes years. Obviously, if the tobacco companies could have limited all their studies to 3 years after you start smoking, we never would have associated cigarette smoking with lung cancer. But here is a retrospective study of women either who did not use statins controlling for cholesterol levels or those who used statins for over 10 years. And what you find is over the course of the years, you see a significant increase until it's more than twice as many women using statins over 10 years for the rate of breast cancer compared to those that didn't use statins. And there are other studies as well, especially in the elderly. You see an association of statin use with cancer. And this simply relates to the fact that people with low cholesterol have significantly higher rates of cancer. So it may be a direct effect of the statin, or it may be increased vulnerability to develop cancer with low cholesterol. You simply find that people with high cholesterol have lower rates of cancer. People with low cholesterol have lower rates of cancer. This is a really important study, totally ignored by statin advocates. This is a random sample of elderly individuals, 75 years of age, all on statins, all of which had gone to the doctor reporting memory problems. So all of which had been diagnosed with mild to moderate dementia. And so what you have here is an explicit study on these individuals in which they remove the statin for 6 weeks. At the end of the 6-week period, they now give them a cognitive test, and the group is significantly improved to normal cognition. And the most important thing now is the re-challenge. They now put these people back on the statins. 6 weeks later, they are back to having the dementia diagnosis. And this is very simple to understand. The brain generates its own cholesterol. Cholesterol cannot get into the brain, but statins can. A subset of statins can get into the brain. The brain must metabolize and produce its own cholesterol. And it needs that cholesterol to generate new synapses, to make new cells, to make memories. If you are taking a statin and it gets into your brain, it will interfere with brain function and give you appearance of having dementia. Now, I had the privilege, I look at it now, that I'm now seen as someone who is in the cholesterol field. Editors come to me to review papers, and they invite me to write commentaries. So the senior editor at PLOS One invited me to write a review of a paper that was very supportive of statins for primary prevention. And I invited others who I greatly respect, Michel Delargerel, cardiologist in France, Malcolm Kendrick, Ufi, and Paul Roche. And we not only reviewed that paper, we also reviewed the extensive medical literature on adverse effects. And the question was, why do people stop taking their statins? That was what the paper was addressing. Well, they stop taking their statins because they feel like crap. And that is really the perceived adverse effects. We reviewed about 50 published papers that how people feel as a result of muscle pain and the myopathy, cognitive effects, injuries, gastrointestinal disorders. That's what people feel when they're on statins, a high percentage. As much as 40% of people have these overt adverse effects. And then you have the delayed effects in which the physiology is hampered. Type 2 diabetes, and as you look through this list, all these other effects are well established. They are in the medical literature. So this is the reason why people don't want to take their statins, and yet they tolerate it because they've been told they're now basically been immune from developing a heart attack. So the third section then, yes, there are meager benefits. Out of every 100 people, 1 or 2 will have one less heart attack. There is almost no mortality benefit by taking statins. There's a small rate of improvement in overall outcomes, but their adverse effects are so extensive that they more than offset any meager benefits. Finally, just a little bit about, well, what is it that actually causes heart disease? Again, I've worked again with Ufi. We published a paper last year with Michelle as well as Malcolm Kendrick. We reviewed the literature on heart disease and cholesterol. First, of course, coming to the conclusion that cholesterol does not cause heart disease. And we look specifically at familial hypercholesterolemia. These people live longer than on average compared to the rest of the population. But a subset of the people with FH do have more heart attacks than the general population. And by looking at this, what we saw, and it was so obvious, with decades of research, that the subset of individuals with FH have another mutation that is not normally studied. That other mutation is hypercoagulation. They tend to have more of the proteins that cause platelets to aggregate, such as fibrinogen and factor VIII. These are people that have extremely reactive platelets that produce clots. This comes along with having high cholesterol. And so in the studies that have looked at both coagulation and cholesterol, what you find is the individuals that have the hypercoagulation are the ones that have the heart attacks. And that is independent of their LDL levels. And that applies to the general population. When you look at risk factors, primary risk factors for heart disease, the common mechanism for the risk factors is increased coagulation. They either activate platelets or they reduce the ability for the platelets to dissolve. It's called fibrinolysis. And so you've got two processes. Both can be impaired in people who have heart disease. For example, high blood sugar activates platelets. When you smoke, platelets get activated. You get stress, your blood literally clots. All this is related, and Ufi mentioned the vasa vasorum. This is incredibly important. These are microscopic blood vessels inside our coronary artery wall. Basically, blood vessels sort of the size of capillaries. And these are the blood vessels that can be blocked as a result of hypercoagulation, where the blood just gets thicker when we get stressed or smoke cigarettes. And when these micro vessels get blocked, the inside of the artery dies through necrosis. There's no oxygen, the tissue dies, and that tissue then becomes susceptible to bacterial invasion. And then what happens? In comes the white blood cells in the LDL to attack the bacteria and repair the tissue. And that is why you find LDL inside the plaque, because it is part of the repairing process. It is part of the attacking the pathogen process. It is not a part of the process that causes heart disease. Last trial I want to cover, the 4S trial. This is very useful, especially for this group. So this is the most successful trial ever. The 4S, as people often point to this as being the best statin trial, because it actually showed a literal, absolute 4% benefit to the population as a result of using statins. This was a trial, people criticize it 25 years ago, before the standards we have now, 25 years ago published, effectively run by Merck. Data analyzed. It says in the paper, a Merck employee analyzed the data. It was kind of a joke, but let's forgive them for that. Okay? Let's accept that this is real. It has never been replicated, but it's real. A 4% mortality benefit with taking 4S, and this is secondary prevention. 7 years later, it's a really important paper published, which is a reanalysis of the data, looking at their lipids. And so they're looking at people who either had high triglycerides and low HDL, which you find with people who have high blood sugar and don't exercise much. And they're also now looking at the people who had low triglycerides and high HDL, which is what you find with people who have low blood sugar and exercise. Both groups had high LDL. So what's really important is you're looking at the difference between high triglycerides, low triglycerides, which reflects blood sugar. And so there is a real benefit. That's this group right here is actually showing reduced survival. Okay? That's the group that has high triglycerides, low HDL. These are unhealthy people. And in fact, this was my lipids. Going back to where I was 20 years ago, I fit that group in having high triglycerides, low HDL. And that is unhealthy. And for the people given the statins, high triglycerides, low HDL, there was improvement. But what's so important is the other lines that all overlap, For the people that had low triglycerides and high HDL, meaning they were healthy, there is no improvement. Those lines all overlap. There is no improvement for someone that's already healthy taking a statin. So for someone that has type 2 diabetes and you've gone low carb and you've dropped your triglycerides and raised your HDL, the question is, will you benefit from the statin? This trial tells you no. If you are exercising, if you have low blood sugar, if you have high HDL and low triglycerides, this trial tells you you will not benefit from taking a statin. And that is what's so important, especially with this group. So for anyone here, low triglycerides, high HDL, and you're exercising, and you're not obese, and you're not eating lots of fried foods and sugar and ice cream, well, then there's absolutely no reason for that person to take a statin. There's no evidence of benefit. And that's this group right here. They all overlap. And again, they had the same high LDL. I really want to emphasize that. The high LDL is common between the two groups. The difference was the triglycerides and HDL. So what I want to conclude is not just to rehash what I've told you. I want to give you statements from people I respect. And they've covered the topics that I've covered here. So George Mann, who battled with Ancel Keys for decades, he battled with people who said saturated fat ultimately causes heart disease. And he wrote, "A generation of citizens has grown up since a diet heart hypothesis was launched as dogma. They've been misled by the greatest scientific deception of our times, the notion that consumption of animal or saturated fat causes heart disease." That's what you've heard here already from Zoe, here from Gary, and now you've had a little bit of that from me. There is simply no doubt that high saturated fat consumption in the context of a low carbohydrate diet is absolutely healthful. Second, from Paul Roche, published in Scandinavian Cardiovascular Journal, the belief that coronary atherosclerosis is due to high cholesterol has been perpetuated by powerful forces using tactics to preserve the profits and reputations of those who promote the doctrine. We have been deceived for decades because lowering LDL, lowering cholesterol, you can use food, you can use drugs, and they'll both be able to lower your LDL, but ultimately provides you with absolutely no benefit to your health. And finally, what we have is Uffe published also in Scandinavian Cardiovascular Journal, the diet heart hypothesis sustained by social, political, financial institutions, which have little to do with science or any established success in public health. So last, I'd like to point out that there is a book I've noticed which is out here available to you. You've got chapters by Zoe and Malcolm, and I've got a chapter in this book, and it's absolutely the best science you can get. It confirms sort of what I have presented to you today. It is the real science. There is no deception in this book. You'll find it illuminating. Fat and cholesterol don't cause heart attacks, and statins are not the solution. I feel a little bit like Sir Isaac Newton, who said, "I stood on the shoulders of giants and I could see further." I have stood on the shoulders of giants in this field, which has enabled me to improve my health, enabled me to see further. Thank you.
All right, we'll take a few questions, give you guys a short break, and then we have one more speaker in our final Q&A. So we're in the home stretch here. While we get the microphones ready, I had a question come in via text, which says, "Dr. Diamond, do you have any great, easy-to-read study that I can share with my father who refuses to stop taking statins because his doctor keeps convincing him they are necessary?"
I get this question a lot, and I emphasize to people, the doctor is not putting that pill in your mouth. I hear often, "My doctor put me on statins." No, your doctor recommended you take a statin. Your doctor has recommended that his father should take a statin. The information is out there. I think that book is a great start. But it's up to each individual to decide what medication they will take. It's up to his father to decide. It is not up to his doctor to decide what medication he's going to take. So I guess to start with that book that I just recommended there at the end of my talk.
Any questions from the audience? There you go. Yep. Shooter's choice. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the sex differences. I know women's HDL tends to be higher. I also know that most of the clinical trials don't include women. And then on top of that, it seems like there is some new research coming out that suggests that women on statins have a much harder time than men.
Yeah, if I had more time, I would have covered the adverse effects of statins. Women develop type 2 diabetes at a much higher rate than men. That study that I showed of a 5% increase was from men. There's a dramatic increase in type 2 diabetes in women on statins. I don't think it's really understood very well why there's a delayed development of heart disease in women. It's about 10 years later than men. May have to do with menopause, not really clear. But you do see more adverse effects of statins in women, and in general, because most of the studies have been done on men and heart disease rates are so incredibly low in women, there's almost no evidence of benefit with statins. Not even the 1% we're talking about with men.
What are your thoughts on HDL levels that are elevated above 75 milligrams per deciliter, even in the 90s?
Yeah, there's a strange paper out there showing that people with an HDL of 90 to 100 have more adverse effects. And so they're now warning people about having extremely high HDL. I find it kind of remarkable. That study you're referring to, those are people who already first were ill, I think with some secondary disorder, I think it was kidney disease, and they're looking at 0.5% of the population that had the highest HDL, and they had somewhat increased rates of cardiac events. I think it's totally irrelevant to a healthy population. So there is no good reason to be concerned at all with extremely high HDL in a healthy exercising person.
All right. One more from text here, then we'll go back to the audience. What are the best markers to measure hypercoagulability for the primary prevention of heart disease?
Yeah, well, there are two ways to look at this. First of all, it doesn't matter. What you want to do is keep your platelets calm. You don't want them to coagulate. It doesn't matter what your fibrinogen is, your factor VIII, or anything else. If you have low blood sugar, you don't smoke, you're not obese, you exercise, the numbers don't matter. You're going to keep your platelets nice and calm. It is basically a fact, the observation, that fibrinogen is sort of the critical factor that has been associated with heart disease, independent of whether you have FH or other factors. But what's so important is fibrinogen by itself is benign. It's just a protein that's in our blood. It is used to activate platelets so that we make clots. But if it's not activated, it's benign. So really, your goal is to keep the platelets from aggregating, from getting activated. And they get activated in response to stress and smoking and sugar. So keep your fibrinogen, your platelets happy. You don't have to worry about the numbers.
Anything else from the audience? We've got one in the far back.
Hey, you mentioned the one study where when they withdrew the medication that there's less dementia afterwards and that it came back. Is there any other studies that show withdrawal effects, whether they're positive or negative? And then would you recommend us to take our patients off statins?
Well, we published a paper. I didn't have time to show a paper that I published, in which we were able to associate adverse events reported to the FDA involving impaired cognition. And what we were able to associate was that there are statins that can get into the brain because they're lipophilic, and there are statins that can't get into the brain. Lipitor, for example, has an easy time getting into the brain. And you find the most adverse cognitive events reported to the FDA come from Lipitor. Crestor doesn't get into the brain as efficiently, and you see fewer cognitive events from Crestor. So from this work, what we can derive is that if a statin can get into the brain, it's going to interfere with brain functioning. As to what to recommend, I absolutely see no benefit of statins to anybody. Now, with that said, if you're the kind of person, probably someone who's not here, if you're the kind of person that says, listen, I just want to smoke, I want to eat French fries, I want to eat a lot of crap, I don't want to exercise, I don't give a damn, I want to take a pill, and I want to be healthier. Well, that kind of person could actually get some benefit from the statins. That's from the 4S study. But that means they've got to tolerate the side effects. So the only person that potentially can benefit from a statin is someone that really wants to depend more on medication than a lifestyle change.